This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our viewers and listeners around the country and around the world. A leading member of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is warning the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is rising more rapidly than expected in recent years. The scientist, Chris Field, says the current trajectory of climate change is now much worse than the IPCC had originally projected, in part due to China and India's increasing reliance on coal power. The research shows carbon emissions have grown sharply since 2000, despite growing concerns about global warming. During the 1990s, carbon emissions grew by less than 1% per year. Since 2000, emissions have grown at a rate of 3.5% per year. No part of the world had a decline in emissions from 2000 to 2008. Early this month, Field told the American Association for the Advancement of Science, quote, "We are basically looking now at a future climate beyond anything we've considered seriously in climate model situations."
On Wednesday, Chris Field testified before a Senate panel and warned droughts caused by global warming could make parts of the American Southwest dangerous to live in. Professor Field joins us now from Stanford University, the founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology and a professor of biology and environmental earth science at Stanford University. He's also co-chair, just been named, of Working Group 2 of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Dr. Field.
Thank you very much.
Why don't you review what you told the Senate yesterday? It was a pretty heated hearing.
It was, and I think it's important for people to know that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, provides a definitive assessment of where we are with climate, but that science continues to evolve. And in particular, we've seen rapid increase in knowledge in two important areas that I call forcing, how hard we're pushing on the climate system, and feedbacks, what we expect the Earth system to do in response to this harder forcing. In particular, we've seen CO2 emissions grow very rapidly, as you've already described. The idea is that we've used climate models to explore possible futures. We characterize economic growth rates, population, kinds of ways that energy is generated, and then use those to say, well, what might CO2 emissions be going into the future? And that's what the climate models run. If we look since 2000, we've seen a rapid acceleration in CO2 emissions, so that the actual trajectory of emissions has grown more rapidly than in any of the scenarios that were characterized in detail. The reason I say we're on a trajectory of climate change that we haven't explored is that we have only looked at scenarios where the growth of CO2 was limited to in the range of 2 to 2.5% per year. We genuinely don't know what a climate will look like with the more rapid rate of increase that we're actually seeing.
And as we mentioned in the lead-in, you see that the increasing emissions from China and India have been part of the reason why the modeling so far has not been as accurate as expected?
Well, it's not exactly right to say the modeling so far. You know, we characterized possible futures based on expectations of the way the world might unfold, and these weren't intended as predictions. They were just supposed to characterize possibilities. But what we have seen is that the time since 2000 was a period of rapid economic growth, and it was also a period of time where a large fraction of the economic growth was fueled by electricity based on coal, and coal is the energy source that releases the most CO2 per unit of useful energy that's released. The consequence of that is that we have seen a very rapid increase in CO2 emissions.
Christopher Field, can you lay out the scenario that you laid out before the Senate? What exactly do you see happening at the end of the century if we go on the trajectory we're on now?
Well, the important thing to remember is that we're not committed to any particular trajectory, and that there are a range of different possibilities. The possibility that is increasingly stark and that we really want to be increasingly certain to avoid is one where we end up with climate forcing at the high end of the possible scenarios. The IPCC projected that with the scenarios it explored, we could see 2100 temperatures that were anywhere from as little as 2 Fahrenheit to as much as 11 to 12 Fahrenheit warmer than possible. And what we increasingly see is that with temperatures at the upper end of this warming range, we begin to get a large series of very dangerous feedbacks from the Earth's system. In particular, we see tropical forests transitioning from taking up large amounts of carbon to taking up very little or even releasing carbon. And it looks like there's an increasing risk that high-latitude ecosystems that are characterized by these frozen soils called permafrost may release some of the organic matter that's stored in this permafrost to the atmosphere. So you end up in a situation where instead of having ecosystems storing large amounts of carbon, they're storing very little or releasing large amounts. The calculations to date are that tropical forests, and this is something that is explored in the IPCC, could, at the higher ranges of temperature forcing, release anywhere from 100 billion to 500 billion extra tons of carbon to the atmosphere by 2100. And that should be put in the context of understanding that during the entire period from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until now, all of the world societies have only released a little over 300 billion tons of carbon to the atmosphere.
What could happen in the Southwest?
Well, if you look at the projections from the IPCC, North America is characterized by a variety of different patterns of precipitation, with increasing precipitation at high latitudes and a sharp decrease in precipitation across the American Southwest. We basically see a big tongue of area that extends from California to about Oklahoma, where the combination of decreased precipitation and increased temperature, increased evaporation, leads to decreased river runoff, and that decrease is quite large, in the range of 25 to even 35%. It really projects a period of extreme stress on water resources, limited availability of water for all of the kinds of water users that are out there, from agriculture to industry to cities to in-stream ecological uses.
Well, one of the centerpieces of the Obama administration's efforts to respond to climate change is obviously the whole development now of carbon emission permits and capping and trading of these permits. As a scientist, what would be your concerns about a solution that centers so much around this kind of a market approach in terms of how effective it might be in dealing with the future?
Well, if I look at the problem, the thing that really strikes me is that we don't have very long to get an effective climate regime in place. The risk with these ecosystem feedbacks is that once we get past a certain point in warming, the problem gets more difficult every year, because we're ending up with essentially less and less help from the oceans and the land. And from my perspective, the really critical thing is that we get a handle on the emissions growth so that we can slow it rapidly and turn the corner, so that we're looking at a period of decreased emissions moving into the future.
I wanted to ask not only about what's happening in the Southwest, but a vicious cycle you talked about that could do everything from ignite tropical forests to melt the Arctic tundra.
The idea of these vicious cycle feedbacks is that once warming reaches a certain point, the amount of assistance that we're getting in terms of carbon storage from the land and oceans tends to go down. And this is quite clear from the IPCC models, and it's clear from a number of other more recent lines of work. In the IPCC, the models characterize a future in which tropical forests at the high range of warming have a potential to release large amounts of carbon to the atmosphere. One of the new numbers that's a great concern to me is that we've been doing studies of how much organic matter is stored in these frozen soils at northern latitudes, permafrost soils. And the new numbers are that approximately 1 billion tons of carbon is stored in the organic matter in these high latitude soils. Climate model projections indicate that at high amounts of warming, large fractions of the permafrost could melt, and some of the projections have that up from 60 to 90% of the permafrost melting. And the surprising thing about these permafrost soils is that the organic matter that's contained within them is not this incredibly stabilized, difficult to decompose stuff. It's basically frozen plants that have been sitting there for, in some cases, tens of thousands of years. And when the permafrost is thawed, these plants decompose quite quickly, releasing their carbon as CO2 to the atmosphere or as methane to the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas that on a molecule per molecule basis is about 25 times as powerful as CO2. The basic risk is that if we reach a certain point in the warming, what we'll end up with is a vicious cycle where the warming causes additional permafrost melt, which causes additional CO2 to be released to the atmosphere, which causes additional warming, which creates this vicious cycle. We don't have evidence that it's a clear tipping point, or we don't know where there might be a tipping point out there. And one of the things that I'm advocating is that we both advance the science quickly enough to figure out if indeed there is a threshold beyond which this can't be stopped, but also to take action as a society.